guys, welcome to Peripheral Vision and happy Sega Month. Today we're going to be taking a look at the Sega Genesis Model 1 video game system. And I say Model 1 because there were actually two subsequent variations on the Sega Genesis model, but we're not really going to talk about those. Instead, we're going to focus directly on this sexy 16-bit beast. Oh yeah, right in the blast processing. Now, I should clarify that I am what you would call a Sega noob. You see, I created this whole Sega Month thing so that I would have the opportunity to explore the Sega community, the games, the systems, all that kind of stuff, and I've actually been enjoying it a lot. It's been an enlightening experience, but just so you know, I've only had about a month and a half worth of experience with this particular system. I think that's kind of a benefit, though. You see, I don't have any of that intrinsic nostalgia that people attach to systems that were part of their history. This is just me looking at another random console, and you know what? I'm pretty impressed with it. But before we get ahead of ourselves, let's just take a look at the console itself. From a design standpoint, the Sega Genesis is a very sleek and stylish console. The color scheme is largely black with red and white highlights, and the only part that ever seemed strange to me was the reset button. I don't know, it just seemed like there was supposed to be a regular button here, and this white textured surface was just the area underneath. In the same area as the reset, we've got a volume control in case you want to plug in your headphones and listen quietly, and the on and off switch. There is an indicator light on top to tell you that your system is on or off, which is an absolute must for any good system. Then we've got a bunch of stuff, including high-definition graphics. And there's actually a version of the Model 1 that does not have the high-definition graphics thing on it, shown here, and if you would like to know, there is a slight difference. This one has slightly better sound. Not notable to most people, but if you're a sound buff, I've heard that the best possible setup is having the Model 1 high-definition graphics Sega Genesis with composite out. So, if you're a sound buff, that's the route to go. Also on the front, it flaunts its 16-bit nature, and the fact that it is a Sega Genesis. Now on to the backside. We have an extension port, which connects to one of the two Sega Genesis add-ons, the 32X, a channel 2 and 3 alternator, then your various outputs, including an AV out, RF out, and AC adapter. Back around to the front, and we have controller ports. Now, I will briefly show off the Sega Genesis controller. This guy. Pretty simple, a big boomerang-shaped black controller with 3 buttons, a D-pad, and a start, and that's pretty much all that's going on here. Fairly comfortable in the hands, D-pad needs a little bit of work, and if you'd like to see more about the Sega Genesis controller specifically, I do have a review up on my channel as far as what this is all about. And finally, the underneath. Nothing much going on down here. There is an extension port here that if you were to pop out, you can attach a Sega CD to the side of it, which is the other add-on that goes to the Sega Genesis. And then we have a bunch of random information about the system, including the model number, which is apparently 1601, even though it's hard to see in the footage. And that's it, the Sega Genesis Model 1 system. This is the outside of it and everything. But what about the games, which are obviously the most important part of any system? And I'm happy to say the Sega Genesis has a lot going on in the area of gaming. To begin, there are over 900 titles for this system. And then on top of that, there is an accessory that you can plug into the top called the Power Base Converter that will allow you to play the complete library of Sega Master System games. So that's well over 1,000 games that can all be played on this. So there's probably going to be a couple hundred that you'll enjoy no matter what your particular tastes in gaming are. Now, the top 3 selling games on the Sega Genesis include Sonic the Hedgehog, Sonic the Hedgehog 2, and oddly enough, Disney's Aladdin, which I wouldn't have expected, but sold 4 or 5 million copies, I think, so these are the highlight reels, but there's a lot more to it. You see, when Sega came onto the scene, it had a very aggressive marketing campaign, especially against its main competitor, the Super Nintendo. Originally, this was bundled with Altered Beast, but later on it was bundled with Sonic the Hedgehog, which symbolized the attitude that the Sega Genesis was supposed to represent. They really targeted an older demographic, not really adults, but more so directly to teenagers. What's interesting about the game library, however, especially concerning Sega-created games like Sonic and stuff like that, they had a lot of maturity as far as what types of games. They took a lot of interesting risks with their styles and physics and different aspects of the game. They have games like Echo the Dolphin, Vector Man, Comic Zone, a lot of games that were more mature from a technical aspect than what you would expect on Super Nintendo. Now, I love the Super Nintendo, but a lot of their games were just refinements of what was revolutionary in the 8-bit era, so they more were about growth, and Sega did a lot of as far as new ideas. You also had your selection of sports games, if you really care about sports games. Now, I don't say that to knock sports games in general, but I do know that mostly sports games fans like having the most recent version of the sport. So going back and playing a Sega Genesis sports game would be at best a sort of nostalgic experience, but when it first came out, they had a lot of official licensing. They had Arnold Palmer, they had Michael Jackson, even though he's not a sports person, but he's the name that came to my head, and there was others. Joe Montana. A lot of, I don't know sports very well, so it's hard for me to remember the names, but they had a lot of officially licensed games, which was also a move to try to appeal to the older, more hardcore, like the original hardcore gaming crowd. So you had a lot of sports games available to you, and of course there was always your classics, your Sonics, and there was a lot of first-party Sega games. Like I said, they were really cool in just a more generalized way, but I always thought it was funny that they marketed in this sort of attitude way. And Sonic really it doesn't have that much of an attitude. He had more of a 90s teenager version of attitude, honestly. But, whatever. But yeah, over 900 games, a lot of really cool titles, and a lot of new ideas, which is, I think, the most important thing about the Sega Genesis library. So, that's it for the games. And I think that's pretty much it for the review. I'd like to say that it has been a very, very positive experience for me playing the Sega Genesis, getting a new one, testing out a bunch of the games, some of the more obscure ones, some of the more common ones, and look forward to plenty of Sega content in the future, because I'm definitely considering myself a Sega collector now as well as a Nintendo collector, or just a game collector in general. So, again, happy Sega Month, and as always, later days. Sega!